I'm Indy Neidell, and this is Out of the Foxholes, where I sit in the same room as my chair of infinite knowledge, but, for now, wearing the tie of infinite smoke, I guess. That's a cigar, that's not a cross. Somebody actually made this. Someone thought, you know what would be a great tie? And they made this tie, and it's fantastic. I'm sure you can buy this one. Just ask Astrid. Okay, but anyway, I sit here and answer your questions about the Second World War. As you may know, Time Ghost Army members get prioritized or even guaranteed answers to their questions. But if you didn't know that, worry not. There will be more on that at the end. Okay, my first question today comes from Time Ghost Army Captain Joe Bloggs, who asks, what was the British Navy doing after the Battle of the Atlantic was won, the Mediterranean was controlled, and there was no more fear of invasion? If there were ships spare, were they sent to the Eastern Theater? Well, the short answer is yes, that's what happened. But the long answer is more interesting, so I will roll with that. But first, let's go back to the Royal Navy's early involvement in the Pacific War for just a minute. At the start of the war, the Royal Navy had, of course, incorporated carriers into their fleet, but with some key difference to the Pacific-based powers, Japan and the United States. Battleships were still considered the masters of the sea, with carriers taking on a more supporting role. In the Atlantic theater, this arguably made sense, as air support could often be deployed from land bases. British carriers were also less of a floating airfield than their American and Japanese counterparts. They were typically smaller, though they did enjoy the luxury of an armored flight deck, which U.S. carriers lacked. So why is this important? Well, because the Royal Navy's Eastern Fleet had a rude awakening in their first engagements with the Japanese. Without enough air cover, the mighty Prince of Wales and Repulse were sunk by Japanese planes. They were the first capital ships sunk solely by air power on the open sea. This resulted in two things. First, that the Eastern Fleet retreated westward and operated closer to British bases in India. And second, the British came to realize that until they could muster a full Pacific fleet on the scale of at least a U.S. carrier task group, any further ventures into the Pacific theater would be foolish. After the surrender of the Italian Navy in the Mediterranean and effective control of the Atlantic was achieved, that is exactly what the British meant to do. With their carrier force freed up, plans to form what would come to be known as the British Pacific Fleet were circulating as early as January 1944. This decision was partially made based on a desire to show the flag in a theater in which the British had been essentially absent up to this point, and to re-exert a level of influence in the region. Britain still had numerous colonies in the East, and if they were to be liberated, it was seen as essential that Britain be at the forefront of those operations. Some in the U.S. Navy opposed this idea, since it seemed kind of like a challenge to U.S. dominance in the Pacific. It wasn't until early 1945, after much squabbling, that these plans really came to fruition. Before the fleet's deployment, Bruce Fraser, the fleet's eventual commander, went on a tour of U.S. operations in the Pacific. He actually narrowly survived a kamikaze attack on the bridge of the battleship New Mexico. Fraser gained the approval and the personal friendship of Chester Nimitz, all but guaranteeing an active role for the British Pacific Fleet in 1945. At the end of the war, the fleet had a strength of 6 fleet carriers, 4 light carriers, 9 escort carriers, 5 battleships, and a variety of other destroyers, frigates, submarines, corvettes, and so forth from both the Royal Navy and other Commonwealth navies. The carriers field some 750 planes, which are a mix of Supermarine Seafires, the naval variant of the Spitfire, as well as American types more suited to Pacific combat, like the Hellcat and the Corsair. Those armored flight decks offered good resistance to kamikaze attacks, and they are envied by some U.S. personnel who say when they need repairs, it's just pretty much sweeping up what's left of the attacker's plane with a broom. The fleet took part in the Battle of Okinawa and the bombardment of the Japanese home islands, but does remain a much overlooked part of the overall naval war. Okay, next up. Here's a question from Nick Macarius, who is a member at the 1945 division level. He asks, throughout this series, we have learned about the various Allied conferences, Washington, Moscow, Tehran, Yalta, etc. What logistical and security measures were taken by the Allied powers to organize these conferences? What routes did Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin take to reach the conferences? Did the Axis powers ever attempt a secret mission to intercept them on their way? You know, like how the Americans shot down Yamamoto's plane. Well, perhaps the biggest logistical challenge the conferences faced was simply getting the three leaders together in the same place at the same time. I'll focus on Tehran and Yalta conferences here, since they were the most difficult to organize and to travel to. Stalin was paranoid of traveling outside of Moscow for any length of time, both from the possibility of being killed while traveling, but also because of the idea of a coup in his absence. He never even met Roosevelt in person until Tehran, and hadn't left the Soviet Union in a couple of decades before that. Roosevelt's physical health did affect his ability to easily travel. Churchill, the only really avid traveler of the three, was approaching his 70th birthday, and even he could no longer travel with the same vigor and energy that he once had. Once the locations and venues were decided, the task became a lot easier. Stalin, if he absolutely had to travel, typically chose to do so in his own armored train, surrounded by guards and equipped with its own communication center. Churchill and Roosevelt tended to take the route through North Africa for the conferences with Stalin. For Roosevelt, this meant a voyage on a warship across the Atlantic to Algeria or Morocco, a flight to Cairo, where he occasionally rendezvoused with Churchill, before another flight to his destination. Churchill faced a slightly more dangerous route. Typically, the first leg of his journey involved a night flight from England to Gibraltar or Malta. He took these flights aboard his personal plane, a modified Consolidated Liberator II named Commando, and later a modified prototype Avro York named Ascalon. Commando's cooler, right?
Much cooler.
Yeah. Ascalon. Commando! Huh? Well, from there, he moved on to Cairo, maybe meeting with FDR before proceeding onwards. Churchill did, however, occasionally mask his movements to and from these conferences by changing modes of transportation, occasionally traveling on warships, as well as using fake names and decoy tactics. This route through North Africa gradually became safer for the pair, FDR and Churchill, as time went on, becoming more or less out of Axis reach altogether by the time of the Yalta Conference. As far as security goes, it was fairly straightforward at the Tehran Conference. The armed forces of all three nations had access to the region, and performing detailed sweeps and making security arrangements well ahead of the conference is easy enough. However, on the night that Churchill and Roosevelt arrived for the Tehran Conference, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov informed their aides that the NKVD were in the process of dismantling a German assassination plot. This alleged plot, known as Operation Long Jump, to assassinate all three leaders, was used as a pretext to try to move Roosevelt to the Soviet embassy. Members of the British and American delegations believed the plot had been fabricated by the NKVD precisely for this purpose, and British intelligence concurred with this in the days following the conference. Indeed, Otto Skorzeny, who was the supposed leader of the plot, we need a picture of him, we've seen him so many times, mentions, he looks more like a movie German, World War II movie.
More like movie German than actual German.
And then anybody, look at that face.
Of course, it's the Schmitz, the Scott.
Come on, he looks like he's the bad guy in a World War II movie. Okay, well, anyhow, he was the supposed leader of the plot, but he mentions in his memoirs that the idea of assassinating Churchill had previously been discussed at the highest levels, but ultimately shelved as an impossibility. He claimed the alleged plot in Tehran simply never existed. Nevertheless, the tale of Operation Long Jump is one that simply refuses to disappear, especially in Russia. Go look it up for details. You should, actually. It's quite interesting. They made all these TV stuff and movie stuff in Russia about it. And my final question today comes from Time Ghost Army Specialist Milton Wyatt Johns, who asks, "Hello, Indian team. I have a question for Out of the Foxholes. German propaganda, as well as Allied misconceptions, painted the Waffen SS as Germany's elite soldiers. However, records show the Waffen SS had inconsistent training and variable equipment of quality compared to the Wehrmacht. Were they really elite troops, or a motley band shrouded in myth and propaganda?" Well, it really depends which phase of the war you look at and what divisions you're looking at. The Waffen SS expanded massively during the war, eventually growing to more than 38 divisions. Some of these were very capable units, but as you said, inconsistency is something of a theme in the Waffen SS. The mythology surrounding them has its roots in Nazi propaganda, and they sought to portray them as the elite guard of the Reich, not unlike the Roman Praetorian Guard. On the battlefield, their reputation was basically carried by a handful of divisions. Most notably, the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, and 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf. Leibstandarte was originally Hitler's personal bodyguard unit. Das Reich has its divisional roots in the original SS paramilitary wings, and Totenkopf was formed from men of the SS Death's Head section. These three divisions saw extensive action throughout the war, as I have covered many times in the regular episodes, and even fought together as a single Panzer Corps. Of course, that's not to say that these SS divisions were the only elites Germany had to offer. The Wehrmacht certainly had elite divisions of their own, and in many cases, SS troops performed more poorly than their Wehrmacht counterparts. This is in part because of a decline of standards in recruiting, which were unofficially loosened to facilitate rapid expansion. As demand for new recruits grew, the Waffen SS started accepting anyone who could pass a basic medical exam, a far cry from their strict criteria before the war. Not only were physical standards loosened, so too were racial standards. Sparty did a whole video on this, but the short version is that because the Waffen SS was last in the pecking order for recruiting ethnic Germans from Germany, the Reichsdeutsche, Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler increasingly turned to recruiting ethnic Germans from Central and Southern Europe, the Volksdeutsche, and non-German foreigners from across the occupied lands. This was also bound up in Himmler's pretty insane fusion of Nazi expansionism and German paganism. He believed that traces of Germanic blood flowed through the veins of some of his foreign SS troops, and they were the building blocks of a greater Germanic empire. He also believed that by shedding their blood in battle, it would flow back into the Reich, strengthening the soul of the Germanic nation. Seriously, watch Sparty's video on that. Anyway, divisions formed along these lines included the Estonian and Latvian divisions, the Handschar division, which recruited mainly Bosnian Muslims, but also Catholic Croats, and the Galician division, which recruited mainly from ethnic Ukrainians. There were Russian and Belarusian divisions too. Despite their names, these divisions also included sizable proportions of Volksdeutsche and Reichsdeutsche soldiers and officers. The fighting qualities of these divisions was extremely variable. The Estonians performed well, as we saw at the Battle of Narva last year. The Galician division, though, were thrown into combat against the Red Army before they were ready, and they were pretty much destroyed at the Battle of Brody. The Handschar were really only suitable for anti-partisan warfare, and eventually so many of them deserted that by late 1944, it was no longer even mainly Bosnian. Many of these foreign divisions, especially the ones raised late in the war, were divisions on paper only, and often they only really had the manpower of a reinforced brigade. Overall, the result of these changes is that many of the newer formed Waffen SS units either saw action as ineffective frontline units or were relegated to anti-partisan and rearguard duties. Quite a difference from the elite image promoted in propaganda. And the elite units, too, were subject to the same realities of the war that Germany faced as a whole. Combat losses, lack of equipment, lack of fuel, lack of experienced replacements all drove down the overall quality of the Waffen SS just as much as it did the Wehrmacht. It's also a misconception that SS divisions were prioritized over Wehrmacht ones to get new equipment. In reality, it's the opposite. So there is certainly a great deal of myth surrounding the Waffen SS. They possessed some very capable divisions, sure, at least in the early and middle phases of the war, but elite status, or perhaps we should more accurately say good battlefield performance, was something specific to those divisions. There certainly was not any inherent, all-encompassing superiority across the Waffen SS as a whole as a result of SS leadership. I think the word you used in your question is the most apt description of the Waffen SS: inconsistent. Okay, that is it for today. But if you want more of this, well, more content from us in general, you can join the Time Ghost Army at patreon.com or timeghost.tv. Patrons get prioritized answers to their questions. And if you subscribe at captain level or higher, you get a guaranteed answer. If you're if you're generous enough to join at the brigadier level, that's the highest level, you get access to a WhatsApp group with me, Sparty, the Time Goes crew, and the other brigadiers, which is really, really fun. We have a lot of great and a lot of stupid arguments there. A little bit of both. If you have a question for Out of the Foxholes, you can write it to us at community.timegoes.tv, but you know where you should not leave your questions? Not right here in the video comments. We love reading all your comments, but we will not be answering those in the comments of Out of the Foxholes. So keep using timegoes.tv or patreon.com. That is all for today. See you next time.